So I'm John Lubbock, and as you said in your question, I graduated from City University ages ago now, 12, 13 years ago, and my master's degree was in international politics and human rights. And from 2016 to 2020, I worked as the communications coordinator for Wikimedia UK, which is the UK chapter of the media network of charities. And so in my job as communications coordinator, I was doing all the social media for the UK chapter. I did some events. My background is kind of, I mean, I'm sort of a writer and a journalist as well as a video maker. So I was doing a lot of content for the charity as well. You know, I'm sure you know, working within the Wikimedia community, that there's not much money at the chapters, so you have to do quite a lot of things with very little resources, and so you know you have to figure out how to do a lot of stuff without very much, especially money, and you know, I think also a lot of people are not that interested in how Wikipedia is made. You know, it's like a sausage. They would rather not know how it's made. And Wikipedia is very rarely the subject of news, apart from when people are angry about what's on Wikipedia, or, you know, when it gets blocked or shut down in countries, as it was, for example, in Turkey for 2.5 years. I do a lot of journalism about Turkey specifically, so I followed the block in Turkey quite closely. So, you know, I think Wikipedia is largely not very controversial in most parts of the world, although obviously there are some parts of the world in which it's more controversial and where it's perhaps seen as more of perhaps a Western influenced thing, which, for example, the government of China doesn't like Wikipedia because it likes to be able to control the media in China. So, I mean, China has its own sort of version of Wikipedia, which is kind of controlled by the Chinese government. And I find that quite interesting. But, you know, apart from those specific places like China, and I think maybe, where else? There was maybe one other place in the world where Wikipedia was fully blocked. But as I said, Wikipedia has been unblocked in Turkey at the start of this year. So I think China is basically the only place where it's fully blocked.
How do you think Wikipedia affects human life in general? And how significant is this project, actually?
Well, obviously that's a very general question, but you know, I think it affects the way that people learn about things. You know, it doesn't necessarily affect the cutting edge of research. If you're a researcher in quantum mechanics or something like that, then you're not going to be getting your information from Wikipedia. You're going to be getting it from the latest research that's in your field. But Wikipedia does reflect, to the best of the ability of the people who are writing it, the basic information about any subject. So it certainly affects the way that people learn, and it affects, you know, what the basic information that people have access to is. It obviously, that depends also on which language they're reading it in. And Wikipedia exists in 305-6 languages, something like that. And I can only really talk about the English version, particularly because that's the version that I use. I mean, I do have an understanding of some of the other language versions, Turkish especially, because I did a lot of investigation of, you know, the specific differences that exist in Turkish Wikipedia compared to the English language version. So I think it can be a bit difficult if you're an English speaker to understand how it affects people in other languages, because I mean, for example, in Turkish, I think it has about 300 and Wikipedia in English passed 6 million articles this year. So the difference in quantity of information is huge between the English Wikipedia and other Wikipedias. That definitely, the amount of people who are writing on the English Wikipedia, it means that the quality is a lot better in English than it is in most other languages. I think that probably affects the world to the level that it probably encourages people to gravitate towards the main world languages, which are all European languages. So, I mean, you could, there are lots of things that are happening in minority languages on Wikipedia. In the UK, we did a lot of work with the Welsh language community, and some work with the Scottish Gaelic language community. And there's also a very small Cornish language community and a Scots language community as well, which is a kind of it's a version of an Anglo-Saxon. Scots English is a kind of English, or it's a kind of dialect, Anglo-Saxon dialect essentially, but with a Scottish accent. But it's considered a different language by some people. So apart from those very small minority language groups in the UK, obviously we largely support the English language Wikipedia. But I think we were quite there is a concern that Wikipedia can be not detrimental to minority languages, but it can kind of encourage people to gravitate towards the main world languages. And so you don't want Wikipedia to be a reason for smaller and minority languages to die out. So it's hard to get a really big general overview of how Wikipedia affects the world generally, but because it's so, the internet is very balkanized. It's really different depending on where in the world you live. What your quality of access is like. My internet connection here is not particularly good in Milan, but back home in London, I have a better connection. So that also affects my the quality of the internet that I can receive depending on where I am. So, like I said, I can only really speak from my point of view as somebody who is from a reasonably rich Western country. But I mean, I have talked to, when I was at MozFest a few years ago, I talked to some Italian Wikipedians who had done a project with refugees who had come to Italy from North Africa or from Central Africa. And I asked them what was the most difficult thing about teaching Wikipedia to refugees from Africa. And they told me that, our understanding of the internet is completely different from somebody whose only experience of the internet is probably looking at Facebook on a mobile phone. If your only experience of the internet is Facebook, you literally think that the internet is Facebook and that's it. So, I think it's very hard for people in more richer Western countries to understand what the experience of somebody who has a very limited understanding of the hardware and the structure of the internet is like. I'm sure you know that when you talk to most people about Wikipedia, most people have absolutely no idea how it works, how it's created. And people always say, is it reliable? How do I know it's reliable? And that in itself is also quite a complicated question. So I'm sorry I didn't give you a very specific answer to that. It's quite difficult to give a specific answer to such a general question.
Okay, I will join my next question. How does Wikipedia influence on world politics and actually in science in the education process in school, college, university?
So, in terms of world politics, I think obviously we can talk about you know, the ways in which some countries like China block Wikipedia for political reasons. Turkey also blocked Wikipedia for political reasons, and in Turkey it was specifically because the Turkish government was unhappy with some of the articles about that they perceived were critical of the Turkish government, not in Turkish but actually in English, specifically the foreign involvement in the Syrian civil war article. One of the articles about one of President Erdogan's sons, and these were articles that included claims made by largely Turkish news media that the Turkish government had assisted militant Islamist groups in Syria by sending the weapons and by profiting from oil that was being smuggled from ISIS-controlled areas. So the Turkish government was very sensitive to accusations that they were in any way involved with extremist groups, and they, you know, the Turkish government didn't really understand that you can't really, you know, the Turkish government is very big on blocking specific content on Twitter and YouTube, and because Twitter and YouTube make money from advertising in Turkey, it's very easy for the Turkish government to go and say, please block this particular piece of content. And those commercial companies will say, okay, fine. But I think the Turkish government didn't understand that you can't really do that to Wikipedia, because Wikipedia doesn't have a commercial interest in Turkey. It doesn't make any advertising money from the Turkish market. So, and consequently, you know, also if a government like Turkey goes to the Wikimedia Foundation and says, please can you censor this one piece of content, then every other government in every other country will say, oh, please can you censor this other piece of content, you know, just block this URL. And I think also that when Wikipedia switched from HTTP to HTTPS, it meant that you can't block at the domain URL level. You can't block specific URLs, you have to block the whole domain. So the foundation just said, well, no, we're not going to block this one page, because then everybody else will ask us to block another page. And so the Turkish government said, well, fine, we'll just block the whole domain then. And then obviously what happened was that the foundation took the Turkish government to the ECHR, to the European Court of Human Rights, and the ECHR ruled that it was a violation of freedom of expression and asked the Turkish government to unblock it. And the Turkish government did unblock it. So, you know, it took 2.5 years, but the foundation won the argument and didn't concede anything. So, you know, in a way, I think that shows to some extent that Wikipedia, or, you know, the foundation and the community is quite powerful, because it's not, you know, you can't really force Wikipedia to give in to like financial blackmail, because they don't make any money from advertising. So I don't know if you could say that that was, you know, an effect on world politics, but you know, I think probably most of the effects on world politics are probably quite subtle. They affect, because it affects the information that we have about particular political situations or historical politics, that I'm sure has an effect on the thinking of people about their own history. But, you know, obviously because most people are reading Wikipedia in their own language, and that language version is going to reflect the views and the understandings of the people who speak that language. So, you know, the article about, you know, some kind of controversial historical figure will be different in different languages, depending on whether they like that person or whether they don't like that person. You know, I probably like the article on, I mean, in the Turkish context, the article on somebody like, for example, PKK leader Öcalan would be probably quite negative in Turkish, but in Kurdish it would be probably a lot more positive than that. So to some extent, I don't know whether it affects world politics, because everybody, again, is reading in their own language, and that language, Wikipedia, will reflect the views and opinions of the people who are writing it. So I don't know if it, you know, maybe it reinforces to some extent language communities. Maybe that's a bad thing. Maybe it doesn't really contribute to necessarily a shared understanding of the world in a way that the foundation would like it to, but but maybe it tends to reinforce the you know, the biases and opinions of people that they already have within language communities.
How do you rate the quality of Wikipedia entries, articles?
Again, it depends on who's writing it, right? So, you know, obviously there's a big difference in quality between English and a lot of other languages. If you look at, you know, maybe not necessarily the main articles, although, you know, I'm sure like the article for physics or chemistry or whatever is probably still reasonably good in some minority languages. But if you look at like slightly less core articles, you'll have a really huge drop off between English, Spanish, French, German, and smaller languages. So first of all, it depends on what language you're talking about. And then it depends on whether the community of Wikipedia editors is interested in that subject. You know, you take things like K-pop bands, for example. Like, there's a huge community of people who are K-pop fans who will go and obsessively edit the articles for their favorite K-pop bands. So the article for BTS or EXO or something is probably really good in some minority languages. I mean, I haven't looked at these K-pop band articles in smaller languages, but you know, there probably are some really good K-pop articles in some quite small languages. But you know, maybe you have, you know, quite important scientific subjects or medical subjects which have very poor entries in some, you know, in some languages where there are 30 million, 40, 50 million speakers. I mean, if you take one of the kind of weird examples of this is like, I can't remember what the language is called, but there's a Filipino language, not like one of the main ones, but one of the smaller Filipino languages, which has like 20 million speakers, and it's like it has like the largest number of Wikipedia articles, or like the second largest number of Wikipedia articles after English, and that's because there's a guy, like a Swedish guy, who is married to a Filipino woman, and he created a bot that automatically generates articles in that language. So the articles in that language are basically all stub articles. So there's like 4 or 5 million articles in that language, but they're all really bad quality. They're just stubs. They're just like one line. So it depends on what the subject area is. You know, hopefully subject areas which are academic and you have students who are writing the articles will be reasonably good. But, you know, for stuff like, you know, like Kenyan oral history, you know, a lot of like African cultural history where you don't have very good, you know, technological resources in places in sub-Saharan Africa, and you probably don't have that many universities there. So you've got, you know, all of those situations kind of prejudice there being good articles about that country or in that language. So, you know, the articles on like Botswana are probably like much better in English than they are in the native languages of Botswana.
Could you share, please, your opinion about sources? Well, today we have too many sources. How to distinguish a true sources with reliable information from a fake one?
So obviously we have the reliable sources guidelines in English, and I'm sure that there are also reliable sources guidelines in most other languages as well. I think, you know, it depends on, obviously you want a source to be verified. So when I'm writing articles as a journalist and I'm looking at things that are being published on Twitter, for example, last Friday I was writing about the earthquake in Izmir in Turkey, and you know, there are lots of videos and photographs being published. If you look at the hashtags for Izmir or earthquake or something like that, you'll see a lot of unverified videos and things like that. You know, in general, you should be sure about stuff you're posting from social media, or, you know, when you're posting it as a journalist. Although in a situation like you know, an earthquake where there's a disaster happening, it's sometimes you're never going to be able to completely verify something. Although obviously, if you know what that place looks like, if you've been there, and if you can verify that video because more than one person has taken a video in the same place, then you can be reasonably sure that you know, that is a video of something that's happening now in the place that the person says it's happening. That's not good enough with a news outlet which is generally considered to be reliable. Then you know, you might want to say, well, I've got no reason to doubt this is not this is misrepresented in some way. So I think, you know, one of the ways that we identify good sources in English on the English Wikipedia is, does that news media outlet have a reputation for reliability? And when I was working at Wikimedia UK, we had this issue with the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, where there was a long discussion by Wikipedia editors about whether the Daily Mail was a reliable source or not. And the reliable sources guidelines already said tabloid news sources are not reliable sources. So the question was then, is the Daily Mail a tabloid source, or is it considered to be a reliable news source? And that can be organizations in the UK, because they might have one part of it which is a tabloid, and one part of it which is maybe a slightly more reliable newspaper. So I think with the case of the Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday, which is their Sunday newspaper, is generally considered to have higher journalistic standards. And I think that the Mail on Sunday might still be considered, you know, a source that can be used, whereas most of the Daily Mail website is now considered to be an unreliable source. And the main reason for that, I think, is that you can't use their articles to establish notability, because they publish a lot of articles about celebrities who are, you know, not really notable people. You know, they're just somebody's, you know, somebody's sister, somebody's husband, somebody's wife, somebody who was on a reality television show, and that does not make that person notable. So, you know, that if you've been on English Wikipedia for a long time, you get to know what is considered unreliable and what is considered reliable. You know, there are some very tabloidy or very you know, just kind of muckraking, you know, pieces, like media sources which are not considered to be useful sources to establish that something is true. I mean, it's also you know, you also have to think about whether something that a news source says is related to a person's notability, because, you know, a person might be notable for you know, being the first person to do something, or being, you know, an elected political official or something like that, and then a tabloid source might say, oh, this person, you know, actually they're like, you know, having an affair or something like that, and, you know, that might not, that's probably not relevant to that person's notability. So if somebody is, you know, a well-known politician, something that's about their private life might not be relevant to their notability, and, you know, somebody might want to shame that person, or, you know, damage their reputation by putting it in their Wikipedia page. But you have to think, well, is that relevant to why that person is notable or not? So, you know, I think it's something that notability and reliable sources are quite connected on Wikipedia. You have to think about what's the purpose of Wikipedia. It's not to summarize every single piece of information that we know about somebody. it's about why that person is a notable person. So, you know, the other thing that you see happening a lot of the time is people will add to their own Wikipedia pages with stuff that is about their own vanity. So, you know, they'll say like, why doesn't my Wikipedia page say that I have a doctorate from the University of something or other? And you're like, well, this is not your CV. This is about why, you know, why you're a public person, and why, you know, what everybody else might want to know about you. Your degree result was 20 years ago? Probably not. So, you know, but I think in general, most of the guidelines about reliable sources are reasonably understandable. You know, something that's self-published, like a blog or, you know, a Twitter post, is not considered to be reliable. Although, having said that, you know, Wikipedia's Donald Trump page, I think, does include links to his Twitter profile, but maybe that's a kind of, you know, in general, that's not good Wikipedia practice. But maybe there are some outlying cases, like, you know, the fact that Donald Trump is notable for his Twitter, you know, Twitter outbursts. So perhaps it's a bit different in that respect. But you know, I think it's something to do with the specific creation of an encyclopedia that you get to understand after you've been doing it for a while. And, you know, this is one of the ways in which Wikipedia is, it has a steep learning curve, because when you start to do it, there's a lot of things to learn. But once you've been doing it for a long time, you just, you know, these things they become like second nature to you. You understand why the rules are the way they are.
Is there any classification of sources? If so, what does it look like?
I mean, there is a kind of a hierarchy of sources to some extent. I mean, it depends on obviously what you're writing about. I mean, if you're writing about more academic subjects, then the first things you're going to be looking at would be academic journals. You know, you're also, I think, from a scientific perspective, or from an encyclopedic perspective on science, the thing that you're looking for is secondary studies. When you're talking about the latest scientific research, you're not looking at primary sources in the sense of, like, you know, to give an example, I remember finding somebody on Twitter talking about some kind of fad diet, some kind of, like, you know, some kind of unscientifically proven dieting system, where they had managed to find one or two primary sources saying, you know, you should basically just, like, not eat any food for a week, and this is really good for you. And, you know, you can probably always find some not very good researcher who's going to do a piece of research that will prove almost anything. But for scientific subjects, obviously, what you want is secondary sources that look at lots of different studies and compare studies and try and take a step back from the research. So I think that's especially important when you're talking about scientific subjects. Obviously, if you're talking about pop culture, then it's going to be different. I think one of the ways in which Wikipedia falls down a bit, or is not, there are lots of areas where we don't have sources for certain things, and whether that's because they don't exist in English, whether that's because they exist in a library somewhere and they haven't been digitized. You know, I think that we'll find in the next 10, 20, 30 years that there's going to be a lot more sources that we can write much better Wikipedia pages with once a lot of libraries become digitized. So I think that's something that is hopeful for Wikipedia, especially when it comes to areas where there are not a lot of available sources. I mean, some of this is also to do with the the age of the age of the digital revolution. We've only been living in this kind of digital age for the past 30 years, really. When I was looking through the archive of my father's papers, my dad died a few years ago, and I was looking through all of his correspondence and the things that he wrote. And basically anything before 1992, everything. There's a word file for everything, basically. So it's going to take humanity a very long time to happen before the 1990s, and then we're going to have to go back to this issue of hierarchy of sources. But yeah, it depends on what you're talking about. If we're talking about something that's happened in the last 30 years, there's probably going to be quite good digitized sources. But obviously, as you go further back in time, then there are standards. For example, like there's lots of medieval manuscripts which are the only sources for something, but you can't say that they're reliable in the same way that you can kind of fact check a more recent source. Yeah, obviously, like I said, the hierarchy in scientific subjects goes basically, your big academic journals, and then, if there's, you might look at more popular science stuff as well. But like if it's a really like core scientific subject, you probably, you don't need like a popular science magazine when you've got like, a really good study in Nature or Science or something like that.
From your perspective, what are the tendencies on lobbying interest in Wikipedia?
I mean, they happen in English as well. I think there was a famous case where I think after the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster in 2009 or 10, there was somebody who was employed by BP, which was the company that was responsible for this oil spill, and they did lobbying in the right way. So communications person created an account and say, look, I'm working for BP, I'm paid, I'm admitting this, and then they went to the talk page of the article about this disaster and said, look, I know that I'm biased, but I think this article is I think they went, it was the BP article itself. After that disaster happened, about maybe 2/3 of the article on BP was about this one specific disaster. And the person from the oil company successfully argued on the talk page that it was giving too much prominence to that particular disaster. So through lobbying in a kind of an acceptable way, they reduced the percentage of the page on BP that was about this one disaster from like 2/3 to like 1/4 or something like that. So it's not that lobbying is always unacceptable. I think that there's kind of an acceptable way to do lobbying if you do it by the rules. But obviously, most companies don't understand what the rules are. I did quite a lot of work at Wikimedia UK with trying to do outreach to the music industry, because one of the things that I noticed on the English Wikipedia is that a lot of musical artists, especially not very good ones, go and edit their own Wikipedia pages. And so you would get, really, really obvious examples of where the person themselves was just, inflating their own achievements and, just using unscientific language because they didn't understand how to write in an encyclopedic way. There's especially like, small labels and musical organizations that promote artists. They often have like their intern go and like improve the pages of their artists, and they will always do it in a bad way. And I think in cases where like you have a small artist who maybe they don't have a really huge fan base, but maybe they are notable because they are a core artists in a particular genre of music, but maybe, you know, it's like a genre of music which appeals to like a segment of the population which is not, you know, not really big on editing Wikipedia, and especially like black music in the UK, like because the editors of Wikipedia tend to be overwhelmingly white. There's a lot of black artists who are notable, but their fans are not Wikipedia editors. So, you know, I think there is a case for where if a company that's promoting an artist understands what the rules are, and they're not writing in a way which is breaking rules, and they're admitting, you know, on their talk page, for example, like, I work for this company, I think that it can be done in a way which is not bad for the encyclopedia. But obviously there are lots of examples where it is bad for the neutrality of the article, right? Especially when somebody is trying to minimize something bad that happened or exaggerate something good about that particular company or whatever. There's lots of cases where, like, a CEO of a company will have somebody working for them, you know, improve their article. And, you know, I've met people who've asked me to improve their article, you know, and sometimes I say to those people, well, if there's something that should be in your article that isn't, as an editor, I can take a look at it, and, you know, if it's not a conflict of interest, because that's something that's to do with your notability, you know, if I have time, maybe I can add a line about this thing in there. But, you know, you obviously, especially when you're part of the community, you have to understand where the line is between doing something that is in line with the rules of the encyclopedia and something which is potentially a conflict of interest because you know somebody, or you like that, you know, artist or that company or whatever. So obviously, again, it's a spectrum, but it's a spectrum of problematicness, from like something that's not particularly an issue for the encyclopedia to something that, you know, could be a really big conflict of interest. And generally, I think if you're a Wikipedia editor, you know where the line is.
What do you believe has to be done in Wikipedia to objective and secure? Just your opinion, like an experienced user. I think you have some position, some rank in Wikipedia, like administrator, yeah, or.
Can you say that again? What should be done to make it more objective, or? And
secure Wikipedia, yeah.
When you say more secure, what do you mean exactly?
I mean secure from vandalism, from re-editing some body, and from some mistakes, from not reliable sources.
So I think that there's no such thing as like being completely objective. You know, everybody has their own subjectivity, and I don't think Wikipedia is ever going to get rid of bias, right? The point of Wikipedia is not that we have a completely neutral thing. Like, I don't think that the foundation, you know, would ever say that Wikipedia is perfect or completely neutral. There's a famous Buddhist story about it's an Indian story called in some versions it's about the Buddha, but in some other versions it's about just like a wise guy. So the idea is like these blind men go to this wise person, and they say like so the wise guy like sees these like 7 blind men, and and there's an elephant, and he tells them like, oh, everybody should touch this elephant and tell me what this object is. And so one of them touches the elephant, and they say, oh, it's like a tree, you know, it's like a big trunk of a tree. And one of them says like, oh no, it's like a big thing like this, you know. And they're all touching this different part of this elephant. And it's not that any of these blind men are wrong about the elephant. They're just all looking at it in a different way and touching a different part of it. And I think the idea of Wikipedia is that we're all blind in some way. And when we get together and we collaborate in an article, it becomes more objective. Now, it's never going to be completely objective because the people that contribute to Wikipedia are not everybody in the world. You know, you would have to ask everybody's opinion in the whole world to find out like the complete objectiveness of what the world is. So I think Wikipedia just tries to reduce bias by having as many contributors as possible. So, but I don't think, you know, the foundation is quite open about the fact that Wikipedia still has biases. Like, not everybody contributes to Wikipedia. There are some big blind spots. There are some big areas where we don't have content because those communities are not editing Wikipedia. So, but in terms of vandalism, I think, again, I can only speak about the English Wikipedia here, but English Wikipedia has definitely got a lot better at reducing vandalism, and a lot of that is to do with technology. You know, bots that patrol for vandalizing edit filters that will just you know, stop you from saving an edit, which is just, you know, deleting a paragraph or includes lots of swear words or something like that. So I think that gets rid of a lot of vandalism. And hopefully people who, you know, most of the vandalism on Wikipedia is not particularly serious vandalism. It's like, you know, if you just patrol like the new edits page, you know, sometimes, or like, you know, there's a Twitter bot called Possible Vandalism, which is like connected to a bot that's on Wikipedia and just tweets out edits on Twitter that are like links to possible vandalism on English Wikipedia. And if you look at like some of those things, like it's just like kids at school, like going to their school's Wikipedia page and like going like, this guy is like the best at football, or, you know, something like that. And so it's not really serious vandalism, and most of that you can just easily revert. Obviously there are some more serious vandals who have a particular agenda and will keep on coming back to kind of, you know, push their agenda, and that's more of a problem, especially when they're not doing obvious vandalism, like just inserting nonsense or swearing or something like that. So, you know, there obviously is still an issue of like political bias, where somebody has a particular political point of view and they're going to an article about something where they just want to, you know, make that article correspond to the way that they view that subject. But, you know, I think in general, hopefully there are people on the other side who will correct that vandalism when they can see that there's political vandalism going on there. And the best way to do that is just to get more editors. So, you know, I think that's the main thing that all of the communities should be doing, is just trying to encourage more people to edit, because the more people we have, the easier it is to stop vandalism. And that's where you know, on some of the smaller language Wikipedias, vandalism I think is more problematic than it is on the English Wikipedia, because if you have less editors, then it might take a lot longer if somebody vandalizes a page for somebody who is removing vandalism to see that and remove it.